As you listeners already know, I have strong opinions about Amazon. I have strong opinions about the new deal Amazon just signed with Long Island City, Queens, and with Northern Virginia. My next guest is an excellent resource on the issue of what Amazon is up to, and I look forward to speaking with her about it. Stacy Mitchell is co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. She also directs its Community Scaled Economy Initiative, which produces a lot of research and analysis. She's been tracking the Amazon headquarters issue for quite a while. She's also been tracking the retail and banking sectors. She wrote a book entitled Big Box Swindle: The True Cost of Mega Retailers and the Fight for America's Independent Businesses. And she has recently released or co-authored a paper on Amazon's stranglehold on the economy. So she joins us now. Stacy Mitchell, thanks so much for coming on the Zero Hour.
Thanks for having me.
I have to, you've done a lot of great research in this area. I have to admit my initial response to the announcement of this deal was a lot of anger. And the anger stemmed from a couple things, but one is I felt almost from the beginning, I've tracked Amazon for a while. I'm not as closely as you have, but enough to feel that from the very beginning, I thought this entire so-called HQ2 search was a charade of some kind, that my personal feeling is that they probably already knew what they wanted to do, where they wanted to put their additional offices, that there was going to be no magic bullet for one local economy, that they just wanted to go out there and see how desperate local economies, how much they would be willing to give them so that they could go back to wherever they plan to go anyway. This was my theorizing, of course, and extract as much in the way of concessions as they possibly could. Do you think I'm completely off base, partly off base? What?
I think you are right. I mean, we don't know for sure, but I think a lot of people who've been following this closely, myself included, believe very much that this was a foregone conclusion. That Amazon knew that it was ultimately going to expand in the nation's capital and in New York. I mean, we should note that these are two places that Amazon already has facilities and employees. In fact, they're the second and third largest location for Amazon's workforce outside of Seattle. These are places where Jeff Bezos, the Amazon CEO, has homes and spends a lot of time. So I don't think it's any surprise at all that Amazon has chosen these locations. I think this is a company that wants to take a lot of power over the economy, and I think situating itself near government power and near financial and media power are a strategic move that the company is making. And I think this whole thing has been really a ruse. Amazon's gotten a lot out of it, but it's been really harmful to the nation's cities.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I also think, by the way, I thought it was a tawdry, desperate, and sad spectacle to see how much our cities and states are really reduced to begging from what I would describe as an oligarchical figure and his company, and this sort of desperate attempts at wooing. It says to me that there is something fundamentally off in terms of the inequality in our economy and in terms of the distortion of power in our political economy. To me, when we have one person in Jeff Bezos, who's the wealthiest man in America, having all sorts of flattery and begging and money thrown at him and his company in the hope against hope that they might do something for a local economy.
That's right. I mean, who is in charge of this country? I mean, I think that's a question that we need to ask, because it really doesn't feel like we're in charge. A lot of the bids, there were 238 cities that got in the bidding on the first round and then 20 in the finalist round. A lot of that process was kept secret. Certainly the 20 finalists, they had to sign non-disclosure agreements with Amazon. We don't know, in many cases, what these cities offered. We don't know what kind of information and data they gave to Amazon. And when we look back at this, we have to, I think what Amazon got out of this were a number of incredibly valuable things that we as a public handed over to it. I mean, one, it got city leaders all over the country singing its praises, talking about how great it would be if Amazon grew and came to their cities. And that in the context of a moment when Amazon was coming under increased scrutiny for its economic power and its sort of growing monopoly over e-commerce and other parts of our economy, when people were starting to look at that and say, hey, wait a second, is this too much power for one company to have? Should we be looking at our antitrust laws? As that conversation was starting, Amazon engineered this stunt where it had all of these officials across the country, talking it up, praising it, this big public relations bonanza that came out of it. And then the other things that Amazon got out of this by having this process, instead of just announcing a year and a half ago, we're going to expand in New York and DC, but by having this contest, they upped the bids. I mean, they made cities have to put billions of dollars in public subsidies on the table in order to compete in this contest. And it looks like at least $3 billion, maybe more than $4 billion by some estimates now, as people begin to tally up what New York and Virginia have offered. Big dollars that are going to go straight to Amazon. And then the third thing that Amazon got out of having this contest is that 238 cities across the country gathered up and handed Amazon a lot of valuable data about land use patterns, future infrastructure directions, information that, and a lot of times, is not public. We don't, other companies don't have access to it. I mean, wouldn't you like to know, if you were a big growing company, about what's happening at a very granular level so that you can figure out where's the right place to site a facility? How can I use this data to get an edge over my competitors? This is watching our government abet a monopoly.
You made multiple great points there, Stacy Mitchell, and I want to emphasize a couple of them. One, the point that we are at a historical moment where finally, thank God, people are pushing back on the monopoly power of corporations like Amazon. The point that you made, that they've used this exercise in order to get political figures from across the country to sing their praises, is a terrific one. The concessions we kind of, we knew about, but also very important. And then the data piece of it, given that all of these companies are in the data mining, extraction, and manipulation usage business, is also terrific. And I think there's one other dimension of this, which I addressed when I wrote about it, but I'd love your thoughts on. I pointed out in the piece that I just wrote about it that Bezos, Jeff Bezos, if his income, if he's earning money at the same rate this year as he was last year, it's a little more than $96 million per day. The $5 million, for example, that Amazon promised to put into training local people in Long Island City, Queens, is about as much as Jeff earns in 20 minutes. Even the money that was offered, the $500 million in concessions on or actual grants for buildings, it takes Jeff a little more than 5 days to make that money. Even the entire Good Jobs First estimates that the actual worth of the New York bid is $2.8 billion. Well, Jeff Bezos can make that in less than a month. So I guess what I was thinking about all of this is that it's not just about the money, although they got tremendous money, but by making New York City and New York State grovel like this, they're really establishing the tone of a relationship, because it's my personal belief that when Amazon violates labor laws or violates environmental regulations or does something else, they want to have established through this process, they want to have disciplined, if you will, the city and state to understand that when it's time to fall in line, they better fall in line.
I think that's absolutely right. I think you're absolutely right about that. I mean, we have to understand Amazon as a company that is really seeking to be a governing force. When you look at the way that Amazon, this is not a company that's simply about dominating markets. Yeah, they're a big retailer. Yeah, they control a third of the world's cloud computing capacity. Yes, they're going after UPS and building out this logistics and package delivery infrastructure. I mean, they are going after all of these different markets that they're seeking to dominate. But the better way really to understand Amazon is not in those terms, but that this is a company that wants to control the basic infrastructure of commerce. They want to be able to set the terms of trade, and they're really becoming a gatekeeper, if you will. Every other firm that wants to reach consumers online, increasingly those firms have to go through Amazon's platform, and that means that it's no longer a market in the sense of a market in a democracy where we the people set the terms for that market. How is it going to operate? Who can participate? How are we going to make sure the scales are fair and all of those other questions? Instead, we're talking about trade moving into onto this sort of a privately controlled platform where you have a kind of autocrat that sets the terms by which every other participant, every other company, every other customer gets to play. They get to decide the rules, they get to regulate what goes on, and they get to levy a kind of tax across all of those businesses that rely on their platform or rely on their cloud services and so on. So Amazon is beginning to take on, to assume for itself some of the functions that belong to government in a democratic society. And I think what you're getting at is that in the process of doing that, it's also shifting the relationship that it has with government and weakening government power in order to further usurp and envelop and smother, ultimately, public authority and assume that authority for itself. I think there's a strong connection. Franklin Roosevelt back in the 1930s, when he really, he created the modern anti-monopoly movement that was sustained in this country up until Ronald Reagan. He broke up a lot of companies. He was really a leader in going after concentrated power. And I think it's really notable that the language that he used, he referred to it as monopolies as a form of industrial dictatorship. And I think that word dictatorship is something that we should reflect on in the context of what Amazon is doing.
It's such a terrifying prospect, and I hope that I'm not sure exactly how to advance public awareness on this. Back in 2014, I wrote a piece suggesting that maybe Amazon and Google and some of these other companies needed to be regulated like public utilities, and people thought I was crazy. I feel now that that's too mild, perhaps, that they are determined to especially Amazon, to create a level of control that we haven't seen in modern times, or perhaps ever, because the technology behind it never existed before, and that this industrial dictatorship is almost here, is my sense. We had the case of some European booksellers, for example, who suddenly found themselves out of business because Amazon didn't, or virtually out of business, decided not to handle their used books anymore the same way through its Abe's Booksellers subsidiary and so on. I'm just wondering what the solution is. I feel, regulation, do we need to break them up? Is that, what's the answer?
Yeah, I think that's right. We should remember that that while it's true that we have never seen anything quite like Amazon before, and there are ways in which I've argued that this is a kind of new kind of monopoly. But we should remember that there are antecedents to it, and I think we can draw on some of those examples. Back in the 19th century, when the railroad came along, a very disruptive technology is maybe how we would describe the railroad today. The railroad came along, and initially there were a handful of these powerful industrialists, people like Cornelius Vanderbilt, John D. Rockefeller, who gained control of those rail lines, and they used their control over the rail lines to disadvantage their competitors in other lines of business. So to maintain Standard Oil's lock on the market, they wouldn't let competing oil companies use their rail lines, and they would also use that control over market access to extort money from small businesses, from farmers, from sort of ordinary people who needed to get their wares to market via the rail lines. And it was their power that actually led to the first anti-monopoly movement, and we got our first antitrust laws were really in response to the railroads. So we've encountered this before, and that's not the only time. I mean, it comes up, with some regularity in U.S. history, and we have always, as a people, risen up and demanded that, a democracy means that we need to disperse power, that we cannot have companies that amass this kind of power, and that is just absolutely incompatible with a free market, with democracy. So I think the solution to Amazon is that we do need to structurally separate its pieces. That is, we need to break it up. We need to look at its online platform and recognize that there's an inherent conflict of interest if you operate that platform that other companies depend on, and then you are also competing as a retailer and manufacturer on that platform. I think those two things need to be split off. So Amazon as a retailer and manufacturer needs to be a separate company from the platform, and the platform needs some sort of public interest oversight so that it's run as a kind of common carrier or maybe a public utility. But essentially, we recognize that this is essential infrastructure and that everyone needs to have fair access to, and that no one entity gets to dominate and use for its own purposes.
Well, I think that's a terrific solution and one we should be fighting for. I would also just add that Amazon and its contractors should also be forced to treat their employees humanely and not in the kind of Dickensian conditions that have been documented in some of their distribution centers. But with all of that, unfortunately, we're out of time. Stacy Mitchell, where can people find out more about your work and the work of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance?
Sure, yeah, our website is ilsr.org, and if you go to ilsr.org/Amazon, you'll get straight to all of our Amazon resources as well.
Okay, well, you guys are doing great work, and I thank you for that. I also thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you.